William Donald Proulx, Proulx. I always have to spell that. I was born October 27th, 1925 in Superior, Wisconsin. I was actually born William Donald Igo, I-G-O. I've always gone by Don. I was the third child of John Igo and Barbara McDonough Igo. And shortly after my birth, they went through a divorce, and my mother and three children moved to New York City. Eventually, my mother married Philip Proulx, a French-Canadian. Eventually, myself and my older brother and sister adopted the name Proulx. Eventually, I don't know exactly when, they moved to Detroit, Michigan, where my younger sister, Patricia, was born in 1929, and my younger brother, Philip, was born in 1931. My mother was born in Wisconsin. My mother came from a family of 11 children, Irish immigrants, and she was raised in Superior, Wisconsin. That's why I was born there, I presume. At that point in time, my mother was a housekeeper, and my father was a used car salesman or a car salesman. I remember nothing about New York City. When we moved to Detroit, I do remember a few things in Detroit, but really very little. And until my parents moved to Los Angeles or Compton, California in October of 1931. I was 6 years old when they traveled from Detroit to Compton, California. They made the trip, of course, at the height of the Depression, and they were able to make the trip by transporting a new automobile, 1931 Chevrolet sedan. That's the way the automobile manufacturers used to transport cars, I understand. Of course, they had to turn the car in when they got to California. So I don't remember a whole lot before 1931. My mother was a liberated woman long before it became fashionable. My mother had 8 children. After my mother and stepfather arrived in California, they eventually had 3 more children. My mother was really the head of the household. My stepfather was not, all he did was work and provide, and that's about it, at least as far as I was concerned. She was a beautiful woman, and was forever young. She died at age 79, but she was modeling clothes not long before that time. She was an independent woman, like I say, long before it became fashionable. And she was definitely the person that raised me. Kind, yes. She was Irish Catholic and went through a divorce, and she was the dominant person in the marriage with Philip Proulx. In 1941 or late 1940, they were going to get a home built. They did get a home built, an FHA home. They paid $250 for the lot and had the builder build them a house. At the last minute, my stepfather wanted to back out of the deal because, my goodness, the payments were going to be $23 a month, and they were only paying $17 a month in rent. My mother put her foot down and said, "Oh, we're definitely going ahead." So, she was the dominant person in that marriage. Never met any of my grandparents. Never. As a matter of fact, I guess my grandmother on my mother's side was deceased, I believe, before I was born. And my grandfather, McDonough, died shortly after I was born. But I never met any of the grandparents. My older sister has done some research on them. The Igo branch of the family were farmers, in Minnesota. As I understand it, my father left home very early because he didn't want to be a priest and he didn't want to be a farmer, and never went back. On my mother's side, her father worked at the docks in Superior, was a foreman or something of some kind at the on the docks in Superior, Wisconsin. Well, he was raised in a Catholic family, and his mother wanted him to be the priest of the family. He had numerous brothers and sisters, and he was just determined that he was not going to be a priest. The Igo part of my ancestors came from Ireland earlier than the McDonough group. I don't know exactly when they came, but they settled in Minnesota, and they were farmers. I believe I had an uncle that fought with the Union in the Civil War. I believe the McDonough group came maybe in 1880s. They did not come over together. They met in Chicago. My grandmother's name on my mother's side was Larkin, and they met in Chicago and got married in the United States. And they had 11 children. I have no idea what they were doing in Chicago. My grandmother's name was Anna Larkin. I don't know exactly how old she was when she died. Hey, well, that kind of destroyed the family, really, because I understand my grandfather after that had a drinking problem, and they had very young children. My youngest uncle was an infant, less than 2 years old, I believe, when his mother died. And some of the younger uncles were put with foster parents for a time. So it really kind of broke up the family. Barbara was the fourth born out of 11 children. Barbara was my mother. During the Depression, I can remember her in the kitchen an awful lot, cooking and washing clothes and cleaning house. She kept a clean house. You see, we arrived in Compton at the height of the Depression. They arrived with 5 children, no job, no automobile, and then they subsequently had 3 more children. They had some difficult times, I'm sure, in 1932 and 33. Eventually, Philip Proulx went to work for Chrysler Motors in Maywood, California. He worked the swing shift, and that enabled him to work during the day. He raised rabbits and ducks. We lived sort of on an acre of ground, and he worked two jobs most of his life during the 30s at least. By 1940, Mother had acquired a grocery store. Our landlady was an Irish woman who was widowed, and she used to go on a bender once in a while, and my mother would walk a mile or so to the store and help her out, and eventually made arrangements to buy the store, probably nothing down and so much a month. So by 1940 and 41, they were in fairly good shape. We never missed a meal and always had a warm bed, but the Depression was on, as you, I'm sure, are aware of from history. So my mother was a dominant person in my life, in my growing up. There's no question about that. We knew there were hard times. Everybody talked about that. I was always extremely interested in current events. Growing up in California, I was aware not only of the Depression, I was aware of what was happening around the world, the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and what the Japanese were doing in China. It was never discussed very much around the family, but we always read newspapers, and I've always had a keen interest in what's going on in the world. It didn't depress me, you know what I mean? It wasn't something you dwelled on. Life went on. Everybody seemed to be getting along just fine. I didn't see much real problems that people were having. I can only remember one incident in elementary school when I was in, I think, the fourth grade. A lot of the children carried their lunch to school, and lunches, somebody was getting into the lunches, and they discovered who it was. It was a family that was very, very hard up, and the kids were coming to school hungry. That certainly never happened in our family, or most families. That was a very isolated incident. Other than that, everybody was getting along as well as they're doing today, I would think. Nobody dwelled on the Depression, really. There was a lot of talk. I remember a lot of talk about the bonus, the World War I bonus, when that was that controversy was going on. I remember when Franklin Roosevelt was elected. And matter of fact, I was out with a group of older children at Halloween time, going door to door, tricks or treats. And I remember going to one house with the group of boys, and one of the boys said to the man that answered the door, "If you don't treat us good, we're going to vote for Hoover." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you'll vote for Hoover, I will treat you good." So I did know at an early date that it wasn't all one way, that there were people voting for Hoover. But I remember that election very well, and I did keep track of what was going on in the world as I was growing up. The World War veterans, American World War veterans, were promised a bonus. I think it came somewhere around $450 to $500. They were promised to get this bonus in 1945. Well, because of the Depression, they said, "Hey, we don't, we may not live to 1945. We need the money now." So they were petitioning the government to, bring the date forward and give the bonus to help people who were hurting because of the Depression. And eventually, when Franklin Roosevelt came into office, they did give the bonus, I think, in 1933 or 4. I don't remember exactly when it was, which helped a lot of people. That $450 or $500 at that time was, a big help. And I just remember a lot of talk about whether they were going to get the World War I bonus or not. My stepfather was not involved because he was a veteran of the Canadian Army. And so obviously he was not going to get any bonus, so it really didn't matter to him personally. He was drawing at that time, I think, a $12 a month pension from the Canadian Army because he had been wounded in World War I. His foot had been damaged somewhat, so that's the reason he was drawing a pension of $12 a month, I believe it was. The 30s were a very hectic time in history, with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and what the Japanese were doing in China in the mid-30s. And as we got closer and closer to the 40s, in 1939, September 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland and World War II started, it's amazing to me that the people were so convinced that we were going to be able to stay out of the war, when it should have been obvious to anybody that we were definitely going to have to get into that war. My older brother, 4.5 years older than me, joined the Army in 1941. He knew that the war was coming, and of course the draft had been, the United States had started the draft in, I think, 1940. They originally drafted soldiers for 1 year. Then in 1941 they they were trying to pass a law to extend the draft and keep these draftees in the Army, and it passed Congress by just one vote. I don't know whether that was in the Senate, or I believe in the Senate it passed by only one vote. So the people were very opposed to getting in that war. Amazingly, of course, there were others that had the foresight to see that we had to get into that war. My older brother, like I say, joined the Army in early 1941. Thomas Eugene Proulx. He put in for overseas duty and was shipped to the Philippine Islands. He shared a cabin with 3 other soldiers, and within a year the other 3 soldiers had been killed in the war. My brother was taken captive on Corregidor. Eventually was shipped to Mukden, Manchuria, where he worked in a machine shop. He survived the war, stayed in the Army, went to language school, learned to speak Japanese, went to officer candidate school and became an officer, and went back to Japan just in time for the Korean War. And he spent the Korean War interrogating Korean prisoners, stayed in the Army for 20 years. He had been in the CCC camp before the war, and he had been in supply. So when he went in the Army, they put him again in supply. And then he was assigned to MacArthur's headquarters. Early in the war, he was at the headquarters when somebody came out and said, "Hey, can anybody here drive a Chrysler?" My brother, who was, I guess, then 20 or 21 years old, said, "Well, I can drive it." And so they said, "Well, take this car and go to the hotel and pick up Mrs. MacArthur and her son and bring them back here to the air shelter, bomb shelter, I guess you call it." So he went and picked her up at the hotel. She said, "No, I don't want to go there. Just drive me out into the country." So he drove her out into the country. Eventually, when the bombing was finished, brought her back to the hotel. After he picked her up and he drove out of the hotel and was driving down the street, she said to him, "Please drive a little slower. I'd rather take my chances with the Japanese than the way you're driving." Strangely enough, he met her again when he was on Corregidor. He was at the commissary, I guess you'd call it. She happened to be there, and she remembered his name and asked him how he was doing, and that was the end of that. But it was an interesting experience. When MacArthur moved from Manila to Corregidor, he went to Corregidor. He was attached to the MacArthur's headquarters, so when the headquarters were moved, he went to Corregidor. He was on Corregidor when Corregidor fell. When they boarded a ship to go from Corregidor to Manila, when they were about a mile or so from shore, everybody had to just get into the water and swim ashore. If they made it, they made it. If they didn't, they didn't. Then they marched them through the city of Manila to demonstrate to the Filipinos how badly beaten they were. But he had a lot of experiences during the war and as a prisoner. I was 16 years old, working in my parents' grocery store that Sunday morning when Pearl Harbor was, when a neighbor came in and told me about the attack. Well, the reaction was, of course, very mixed, but most people were just absolutely, totally surprised. It shouldn't have been a big surprise, but it certainly was. My brother knew it was coming. I know all my friends in my age group knew that war was imminent. And so how it happened was a bigger surprise than it should have been. Of course, we were all concerned because of we knew what problems he was in. My mother stood up to it pretty good, and eventually we did get word that he was a prisoner. Eventually we were able to send him a gift package of a certain size that included a lot of things like vitamin pills and cigarettes and things that you might think a person would desperately need. And he eventually got it. My sister has written a book about his experiences, and he had a lot of experiences, I can tell you.